It is always a great pleasure to come back to the central bank. I remember that the last time I spoke here was 15 years ago, when we commemorated the first 10 years of the one-to-one parity. And I want to take advantage of this to render homage to Professor Oliveira, who, as you know, died recently and who played a significant role in the development of economic theory as a science, economy as a science in Argentina. He was a very special person, not only as a professor, but also as a person who actually inspired us and made us realize that economy is fascinating from the intellectual viewpoint, and I think that is one of the greatest things you can give to students, and he did it. And we regret the fact that he has passed away, and I want to recognize all the work and efforts he had made for the benefit of Argentine economy. The presentation I will be giving now took a bit of time to prepare, because in a short time to speak about such relevant issues may be difficult, but I will not go in detail about the Argentine issues, about economic policy, first because we will have many panels on that aspect, also for a matter of time. But what I will do, however, is to make a presentation that considers first, at the first assumption, that external factors in our economies, emerging economies, are very important. So in this attempt of stabilization, not only monetary stability, but within a context of growth, it is very important to consider external factors. And my approach will be made on short-term issues. This is what I was telling you a minute ago. And we have a complicated time now, because the external world is very difficult to understand. When we spoke about 15 years ago here at this forum, it was easy, or fairly easy, to know what to do because there was an external anchor. The external anchor now is not very clear. There are external issues, and to the point that when you speak about inflation here, and you come from the north, from the northern hemisphere, it's a change of temperature, because the problem there is actually disinflation. And deflation, is a phenomenon that we hadn't seen since the 30th, and we know very little about that. We know that it is also difficult for deflation, as it is happening in Japan. So it is important to try to understand that, and I will try now to go a little faster and to speak about global liquidity that we're facing today, the central liquidity puzzle. And this is a graph to show how complex this is, and I call this the central liquidity puzzle, as I said before, to focus on something and to use it as an intellectual guideline. The 2008 crisis was accompanied by a liquidity crunch, a fall of liquidity of significance, but at the same time there was a move towards the dollar. And that is another way of liquidity. So it's something very curious. We came from paper that had water, like the mortgage, and we thought it was a good idea to go to papers that did not have anything to back. Well, probably the government is there behind it, but if you go to the Federal Reserve with $1 and you want an equivalent in goods, at least I will be given a new dollar bill or note, but nothing more than that. So what makes these to exist. It continues to exist, and the phenomenon of liquidity we are living today is such that if you take a look at it, it's amazing. It is a terrible situation to such an extent that some countries have even negative interest rates, such as Sweden. And you know that a negative interest rate is an inflationary tax, not on the notes, but on the deposits. So those countries are facing that, and we're trying to go out of inflation to show the world that we're trying to exit. But the North is trying to apply this inflationary tax. So our problem is completely different, but it is important to understand the whole picture. This is something that Keynes had, and I was writing a lot about this very recently, and I call it the price theory of money. The price theory of money is a play of words. Probably you may think that money explains the level of prices. This is how we think of it all the time. But he proposes to think the other way around, that money is so attractive because we all set prices in terms of money, particularly in those countries that are stable financially. So this is what this explains. For those who are listening to us, who are not following the English version, it says that what those are giving support to the money is those who set our wages and fixing our wages in terms of money, and we let them fixed. In highly inflationary countries, we want people to do that, but many times they don't. But in stable countries, it is something good, something we aspire to, but they complicate things because money has something that nothing else has. I may have a bond, but the bond price may fall, as it happened during the Lehman crisis. But while all this is happening, the salary of people remains the same. So I could call a plumber who has set his price in dollars, and I knew how much it cost. And it was convenient to come out of a bond and to fix my home or fix my house. So try to go away from a bond investments. So this is the basis for the trap of liquidity, as it is called. As I was saying a minute ago, money dominates other instruments, particularly those that are called reserve currencies or reserve monies. And it explains precisely what I was saying. But at the same time, you understand that this helps understand why the reserve money has become so attractive in the short term. But it also helps understand the limits of that reserve money. To the extent that you can, of course, central banks can, in central countries, have the ability to issue money and pay for their fiscal deficits, their government deficits, but at the same time, from the monetary viewpoint, they could find some restrictions. I don't have time to go into detail regarding this phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon that I studied, which is the liquidity deflation. One thing is to pay taxes, to pay the government deficit for that. Another thing is to give liquidity to the system. It's a different thing. But I cannot go into more detail, however. But when I start issuing and printing more money with this QE, that could increase the real value of the money out there, but that money will not represent a greater collateral. It is not always going to help the credit system, because that's the weak point, the weak link. It is the lack of credit what is very much behind, is lagging behind, and has made it difficult to recover in the northern economies. And credit is also an issue for us. But I would say that if there is a common issue between the north and the south, that is the credit market. And increasing the amount of money could not be effective any longer. I don't have time to go into the economy theory of that. But what have we done? We have adopted a few things from the north, which were done almost mechanically. They started reducing interest rates. They got to zero, and then they started thinking about a different thing, as if they were desperate, going from one to the other. The theory was not there. The macroeconomy theory we had was not useful at that time. There was nothing they could find new. And the fact that the interest rate was zero, and it couldn't help recover the economy, that was a very rare situation. What happened? The world ran out of ideas, and we had to think about where the problem was. But we have tried to solve the problem following very conventional thing. QE probably is not. Negative interest rates is non-conventional too. But central banks are being asked to do things that, from the viewpoint of effectiveness, do not have great power. And with all these complications, it explains why the North is still not recovering, or if it is recovering very slowly from its problems. So we still see the liquidity trap issues, and we still see the difficulty for recovery of the credit market. And the problem is being addressed from the macroeconomic perspective with measures that in the model could be applied anywhere. Now, in order to show this in a graph, you could take a look at this situation where you have a credit sudden stop. That is the central point, where savings usually go to the private sector. They turn into investment. But if all of a sudden there is a stop of the flow of savings into investment for some reason, because something is not working in the financial market, then people tend to resort to liquid assets, safe liquid assets, the dollar, for example. And that's what we call liquidity trap. But if I say I have a problem here, so let's take a person, a student, a freshman, and we tell him, look, this channel has been cut off. This bridge has been cut off. But there was a very serious problem with the Lehman Brothers. So that bridge has been broken. People want to take this road. But of course, that does not stimulate any investment. So the central bank puts more of these. Is it solving the problem? It's doing this in order to wait for the bridge to be rebuilt, but the bridge is not being built. We're not doing that because the central bank finds it very difficult to rebuild the bridge, because it is more of a structural problem, more of a fiscal problem. But as this is not working very well because of that phenomenon I told you, I have a strong currency. By printing more money, I'm not adding collateral to the credit, because people think this is a currency, but there's nothing backing it, behind it. So it does not serve as collateral, and it does not solve the problem. So the next time we will have to have negative interest rates so that people go out and try to go here. But I haven't rebuilt the bridge. I haven't repaired the bridge. So people may try to leave and buy more iPads, but I want them to go to investment, innovation, and important stuff. So what are we seeing? That European banks now are in a very serious problem at this point in time, and it is very difficult to fix it for political reasons. So this is where we are now, a world that is trying to escape from this situation and has some instruments that are politically difficult, are complicated, and the central banks have had a great capacity to fix things, trying to compensate for these liquidity crunch that would resulted from the Lehman crisis. But now they are at a point in which they have not been able to reactivate credit, particularly in Europe. And it's not easy to find the instruments to do so. So they're trying to do it indirectly. So where we are now, as I was saying, deflation has not been defeated yet. It is still significant. Total factor productivity is flat. It has flattened significantly. There's no innovation. And the measures that are being taken do not seem to be very much effective. And so it is not surprising that under these conditions, we may start speaking about not repairing the bridge, but worsening things, speaking of protectionism and starting to play with the exchange rate. And I really sympathize with the fact that the central bank wants to have a flexible exchange rate, but in a world with strong currencies, if the euro devalues its currency, it's doing something to the US, and the US will do something to the European sector. So there are problems with that. We're not facing them because we are a small country, so we can't afford to have a floating rate, but the rest of the world will not tell us that you are creating a systemic problem to them. So we have that advantage of being a small country that is not affecting others. But when you speak of strong currencies, such as the euro and the dollar currencies, well, a problem may arise, and it cannot be avoided. But there's a whole discussion regarding that, about the international monetary system, and that is a problem that is always there. Now, very quickly, I will show you some empirical evidence. If I take the euro and I take the money stock as an output of product, this has increased as a percentage to GDP with this crisis. That's a liquidity gap. And at the same time, credit flow has, in a way, collapsed in Europe. It is impressive. It was about 50% of GDP, and it went to zero. And by the way, we have said that what we need to focus on to see the credit problem is not the credit stock, but the flow, the credit flow. That is what makes the difference. And we try to focus on the stock, but there's a fall in the flow. And if you take a look at Europe also, this is the inflation rate near zero, in spite of all the efforts that have been made. And the real GDP has recovered, but only barely. In the United States, we see something very similar. The velocity of M2, which is a reverse of money demand, has fallen to levels that were unprecedented and were seen only in the 60s. And if I go backwards, these are levels that are record levels. The demand of liquidity is impressive now. And that is followed by a phenomenon that probably has something to do with the shadow banks, where they increase the speed of money too, with the creation of those shadow banks and that effect. And this is where we are now. This is to verify what I was saying. You can see in the US there is a flow of credit drop in the banking system. So they were not very important for the banks in the US because the shadow banks were already around. But you can see that the credit flow started with 15% and it fell very abruptly during the crisis. And here you can see a greater recovery, however, compared to Europe, in line with the fact that we now have some green shoots. But in any case, something that is important to emphasize is a total factor productivity has in a way flattened. If you have the GDP plotted here, it's not that flat. It continues to grow. It is beyond the trend, but it continues to grow. But if I take the productivity, it flattens. We are in a world, therefore, that is very Malthusian in a way, and using policies that probably are not that effective. It is important to consider that because that is a source of instability for emerging markets. Because emerging markets are a part of all that, and there is something they look to, a north that we anchored to in the past. We even set our exchange rate, considering that that was a very strong anchor, but now we are in a situation in which you need to set your exchange rate, but compared to what? To the dollar, to the yen, to the euro? Because each country is doing what they want. The countries of the north do not have a clear, probably, idea of where they will go, in addition to the political problems that make it even more difficult to have that anchor, that clear anchor. And that's something I wanted to focus on and why I'm so much concerned about the Northern Hemisphere countries. And in that regard, I liked very much what Federico was saying at the beginning, and that is that we should focus on the macro-prudential policies. We live in an unstable world. It is relatively stable, but it could become unstable any minute. We don't know what would happen if the interest rates would go up in the US. There could be some effects if that happens. So a point that the central bank, going back to our central bank, something that we shouldn't lose is our macro-prudential policy. And this is something that has disappeared in a way in some areas as a result of the confusing situation we are in. We know very little about that. Economists cannot help a lot because there isn't much research on that, and we need to recognize it. So there's a lot of art here and of luck involved in all this. But we know some things for sure. We know that the debts of the banks may pose a difficult situation in Latin America and emerging countries have done a lot of work, and the most unstable portion is that what causes sudden stops is actually capital flights through the banking systems that go to short term. They have the support of the central banks, and you know very much about that. And we shouldn't forget about the issue of disintermediation. Federico was saying that the banks need to be regulated, but as you know, the financial industry have very capable people. But if you put some blocks or some obstacles, they go other ways, and you need to support sectors that were not considered as part of the responsibility of the central bank. The example during the Lehman Brothers were the investment banks that were finally supported by the Federal Reserve, although they were not supposed to be supported by the Fed. Now inflation, and now very near our home, and I will touch upon this. In the emerging market monies, they are similar to junk bonds, and they are very keen to junk bonds. We have problems with currency substitution, so there is a high instability in the money demand. It may seem stable. We have lived many things in Argentina of this kind, stabilization plans that cease to be effective from one day to the next. And there is a savings flight, and we don't know what it caused, that flight. And in that environment of instability, it is very important for the central bank to consider that, because you may be tempted to use sophisticated systems but do not have that element into account, the fact that the capital flight may occur and that these currencies have a fragility that is actually not contemplated in the models. But we should include those factors as well, because these things may also happen when thinking of what policies to implement. So under those currencies, you understand that all of a sudden central banks are doing things, and I'm not recommending anything like this, but they advise some possibilities to make those currencies stronger, setting the exchange rate, or if there's high volatility, try to anchor it by pegging to a strong currency. Or else, inflation targeting, which is to peg to the goods. And something that the central banks should not forget, again, is to look at the credit flow. What banks are doing, what type of credits they are granting. And that is not purely monetary, probably wasn't considered in the past, but the credit market has a key role in the operation of the economy as a whole. And I say this, that will probably seem obvious, but in everyday practice, speaking with many central banks in the region, you see that it has been very easy to forget about that. In times of stability, one tends to forget that credit flow. Well, you think of the credit market as something outside the central bank. Central bank is responsible for setting the price, but when the market is not operating any longer, then the credit, the whole economy is affected.
Otra cosa que tenía para
Other things I had to tell you are better known. The importance of credibility here, and I mentioned the thing that expectations alone may generate high inflation. Say, for example, what I'm illustrating here, if interest rates are high or if inflation rate is high, people start increasing prices, so the central bank is faced with a serious problem. I had a paper written in '88 in the American Economic Review. I had no time to go into details, but I want to emphasize that entering a poor equilibrium or inflation equilibrium because of mismanagement of expectations may lead to inflation, whereas if these had been properly managed, we would have been in a proper equilibrium situation. And it's not only an issue or a strategy for the central bank, but also for the government at large. For Argentina, this is a very important phenomenon that we need to control, and efforts are being made in this direction. There are other issues which are far better known. We have used the exchange rate as an anchor. Sometimes the banks say, I cannot use it because I have no reserves. Well, sometimes even if you don't have reserves, what theory suggests and practice shows is that I accumulate reserves by receiving money coming from speculative purposes. If I anchor the exchange rate, maybe because I'm going through a period of instability, someone will say, well, but if you anchor the exchange rate, you won't have reserves, that you won't go anywhere. Well, it all depends. In a speculative environment, pegging the exchange rate, bringing calm may bring in short-term capital inflow and bring tranquility to the system. We live in a world where the central bank has to be as clear as possible and be ready to understand that there may be circumstances where it may need to turn to this. And the idea is to convey this idea properly so that people won't think that the central bank is lying to them. If we can understand the problem and properly communicate it, that I think is very important. Floating exchange rates. It is well known that bringing down inflation with a floating rate exchange rate does bring unemployment issues. It is a natural outcome. And if I use the interest rate, I might avoid unemployment problems because it is, in that case, the amount of money would be endogenous. This has always been an issue. when it comes to controlling inflation by controlling the amount of money, because if I control demand, I will have a liquidity crunch and so on and so forth. But when anchoring the interest rate, automatically the amount of money is adjusted. I might very well, at a low cost, do so. But it all depends on credibility. The issue of setting the inflation rate is highly debated in the profession because actually the interest rate is a relative price. So how can stop inflation? What theory emphasizes is that I will have sticky prices. But in a world where prices need to be controlled, where the initial situation is that prices are a little bit messy, so to speak, or deorganized, so it is not all too clear that this is a good anchor. Probably these might be de-anchored because what it boils down to is working on prices. I was talking to some of the colleagues yesterday, and this issue that the public sector should be the one that will follow central bank guidelines. If the central bank says 17% inflation, then public sector salaries should follow that, taking into account also productivity. That's very important. Curiously, I mean, talking about Japan, this is a topic that came out. Japan does the opposite. My advice to Japan is the following. They want to create inflation. They cannot reach that percent. So a piece of advice to them is that the public sector should increase salaries to 2% to set the example for the rest. We are living in a curious world. These things are coming out where prices are the leaders. And the amount of money, if you are not careful, the one who manages is P, not M. I don't know if I have left anything out. This is a model where all things may happen. The conclusions are simple. They evidently are drawn from what I mentioned. The actual global context is complex, and we have to be ready to await and stand external shocks. We do not have a global monetary system in place, in my opinion at least. It's an issue of beggar thy neighbor that is coming up, and this may become even worse. Credibility is central, but it also depends on external factors that can be unruly, which also contribute to weakening our position. The floating X rates, I sympathize with the bank's objectives, and I think that under ideal conditions, it is important, useful. My concern, however, is that the interest rate anchor alone is limited as such as an anchor, and we have to be careful because there are things like the ones you have listened where the real exchange rate is being appreciated. We should close international trade, a Trump-like approach. This is something that we should remind the politician who suggested it. Sorry, he made a comment off mic. Financial regulation must take center stage. With that, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Bueno, tenemos unos minutos para preguntas. Va a haber micrófono.
We have a few minutes for questions and answers. 3 brief comments in the meantime. First, the issue of macroprudential regulations in Argentina. This is one of the most successful state policies Argentina has implemented. This started back in the 90s, And all governments which have followed different political lines have maintained it. In our case, it was under the Basel umbrella, and so much so that last week we were at the Basel meeting discussing at the Committee G host, which is defining Basel III rules, and all rules that they were discussing, Argentina is already enforcing them because of its obsession and focus on macroprudential regulations. Guillermo has a number of papers dating back to the 90s that compared stability based on money or on exchange rates. This has been a great reference for us, and we've always said that the idea of looking for stability that won't use the exchange rate, well, in your papers, what you say is that that is more cumbersome, so to speak, earlier on, not to a lesser extent because there is no coordination of expectations as clean as it may be with the exchange rate, but based on the experience in Argentina, I mean, all of our past experiences worked on at first when using the exchange rate, but these in the long term generated far worse problems. And I would like to make reference to a paper which is very interesting by Andrés Velasco Alontornel, which compared fixed and floating exchange rate. He said floating exchange rate demands more credibility because nothing is hidden. Where your fiscal policy is inconsistent, your monetary policy is inconsistent, the financial market will set the exchange rate from day one, and this will allow you to build better reliability. Added to something else, another major work area that Guillermo has worked on with a wonderful paper called Fear of Floating. That is, floating has to do with currency mismatches on balance sheets. Argentina is very special in that regard because the 2001 offers significant learning opportunities, and those mismatches have not only been minimized under banking relations and in the hands of economic agents, but also Argentinians are net creditors in terms of foreign credit assets, so that fear to floating today in Argentina works the opposite. So this is an additional element to move towards a floating exchange rate where we may focus on inflation. That is, the core objective here is to rein inflation. That's quick reactions to Guillermo's presentation. A couple of questions we will entertain, and then we will have Rodrigo Vergara. Thank you. Rodrigo Vergara from the Chilean Central Bank. Guillermo, the traditional solution of the liquidity trap was the fiscal policy. What's your vision regarding the possibility of using the fiscal policy in developed countries? There's a strong pressure by not only academic economists, but also international institutions, including the IMF, to have a further expansive monetary policy, even despite the one undertaken when there was a high public debt. In the emerging economies, we saw the opposite, probably because of credibility issues. So what is your opinion about that? Mario Blecher? Shall we take 2-3 questions and then answer them all together? Mario Blecher, good morning. Thank you, Guillermo. Your presentation has been very interesting. I would like to ask 2 questions. As part of the unusual package of measures that are taken by developed countries, one of the instruments is the forward guidance. It appears to be, I mean, I do not have an instrument, so I'd better talk and try to have people believe me. So I would like to know what your opinion is about this instrument, which is one of the central elements in the monetary policy. Yet also they speak about normalizing the situation in advanced economies, which means this is not a normal situation. But in order to normalize the stock of money available, this has to be absorbed somehow. So the question is whether this will be nominally absorbed, that is, whether there is a way to attract that liquidity back, or in real terms, that is with an inflationary process that will end up being like the traditional ones, or whether the situation won't go back to normal. I have Sebastian Katz here. Yes, Professor Calvo, very interesting. At our monetary theory courses delivered in the past few years, we joked saying that in Argentina, we had a mutually convenient swap, which was exporting a central banker, among the most prestigious present here, and import a central banker from the rest of the world. The situation has fortunately changed, but in the developed world, something that comes up is the Keynes problem. That is that in the liquidity trap in the inflationary problem is push on a string. There is an option, Rodrigo was mentioning, in the fiscal policy, but the Basel Bank, and I understand that you touched upon that in your presentation, mentions problems on the side of supply. We don't know whether the productivity pace that we lived before the crisis was sustainable, or whether eventually what we had was one that had been inflated because of the trend towards financial instability, and this idea that we somehow have an economy, the productivity of which is declining because of structural reasons, and the macroeconomic policies are simply using a kind of respirator. So there should be a balance between aggregated demand and aggregated supply. Any other question over there? So we'll take these two questions, and then we'll give Guillermo a few minutes to answer. Good morning. Mr. Calvo, I would like to know your opinion regarding the relation existing between the dollarization of the economy and the effectiveness of the monetary policy. Guillermo Ortiz, and then, yes, we will give the floor to Guillermo Calvo. Further to Mario's question, one of the significant elements in these monetary policy instruments in advanced nations is this forward guidance. In the past, we talked about the importance of anchoring expectations. Now then, since forward guidance is information dependent or data dependent, the result of that is that the whole market is trying to guess what each piece of data means for policymakers at the Fed. And rather than contributing to anchoring expectations, this appears to be a source of confusion. That is, the market looks at data, tries to guess what the Fed will do. The Fed is looking into markets, and this has resulted in these risk-on, risk-off situations, which have had such a strong influence on our country's monetary conditions. So you don't know if you have any comments about that. 5 minutes, Guillermo? Can you answer all questions in 5 minutes? Fortunately, I have 5 minutes only. Otherwise, you would realize where I'm standing. Well, the questions are most pertinent. As to forward guidance, I cannot take it seriously because I say, who guides the Fed? If you tell me who guides the Fed, then forward guidance offered to the Fed might make a difference. That has been discussed in terms of models, which are several, but which exclude the type of thing which I need are central. The credit market should work, supposedly works, and that I see is one of the major sources of friction. In Europe, for example, the over-indebtedness has not been solved. That type of problem in turn reminds me of the problems in this region back in the 80s until the Brady plan Brady plan was implemented. So there is over-indebtedness, which is trying to be fixed by guiding what? I mean, we don't look at that bridge, that broken bridge that I mentioned. So honestly, I cannot take it seriously. If you now, I cannot understand how it works. What Guillermo Ortiz said is valid. If I say I'm going to guide you along that way, but depending on what you do, you may say, well, and now what? What shall I do? Well, it depends on what somebody else does. So it's we reach the point of multiple balances, and that's the problem of liquidity. I mean, it's an issue of multiple balances. Under normal conditions, this should not be an issue, but I don't see it this way. I think that, I mean, it's like trying to walk while pulling your own shoelaces. I mean, how can I guide if I'm not in a position to do it? Also, when the government has no reserves and the market starts attacking and the government wants to guide by using the exchange rate, it won't be able to guide absolutely anything. Well, if you say, I will devalue, depending on whether you believe I will devalue the currency or not, well, that's the end of the central bank. I mean, if you let people decide, why have central banks? In terms of fiscal policy, this is a desperate attempt by central bankers. There are certain, by economists, sorry, there are certain things that only macroeconomists may think of. If I make money less attractive, then this will reduce unemployment and increase the aggregate demand. Why do I say this so easily? Well, because in macroeconomics, there is just one asset. If people either want the asset or the money, that's the only one that is being produced. If there is unemployment, and increase the demand for that, so the demand for unemployment drops. If I have plenty of property and I make money less attractive, well, what shall we do? Well, people will buy more iPads, but that's in the case of young people, but their parents won't intend to make a better company. When you speak of fiscal policy, they say this in the air. I mean, they don't go down to the specifics. But others, Krugman, for example, Larry Summers, they say we need infrastructure. It's clear that the USA, whomever takes the train from Washington to New York knows that has to be fixed, and there's room for more, and it can be done by the state, which plays a key role. But I don't need this to be a result of the macro situation. This is something that should have been done, and now we have the possibility to do it. Interest rates are low for the state. It is a good opportunity to do it, but not necessarily from the purely macroeconomic standpoint. The irresponsibility of the IMF amidst the crisis that said you should all spend more. We saw what the outcome of that was in Central America. All countries spent more. And all of a sudden, the fund said, oh, how come? And now, how shall they pay for their debt? So when things got unstable, well, they said that they had to implement a fiscal adjustment. I'm worried at moving towards the fiscal policy from the macro standpoint. But the fiscal policy is very important for many other reasons, infrastructure being one of them. As to the monetary policy in economies that have reverted to the US dollar, well, dollarized economies, if I think of traditional models used by macroeconomists, what shall I do? The demand for money will tell me not only it is a function of usual variables, but also will play, I mean, the expected devaluation rate will play a more important role than in other models. So I incorporate that into the model, and I will have one where the elasticity of demand will change. But the central bank will incorporate it in its model and will say, well, this is my monetary policy. It should not be something of the essence. Of course, if money disappears, If the national currency disappears, it will be an issue. From that point of view, it won't be fundamental. What is fundamental, and we should work on, and I insist on this, is that in those situations where have currency substitution, using the US dollar or any other currency, that will give a far more space for these discontinuities. It will make it easier to engage in a run against the national currency when people use the US dollar, because they have other means of payment. And if they don't use US dollars for just anything, or as it happens in the US, that they use the dollar and no other alternative, I don't have that possible shock. Related to that discontinuity. So that I see very complicated, and making national or domestic assets, domestic currency denominated assets to follow is very important, because that closes that is very difficult to fight that. And if you fight too hard, what can you do? Impose 100% reserve requirement on banks, you will become risk averse, and the banks will no longer serve the purpose of serving the credit market. Much more might be said, but nonetheless. Well, thank you, Guillermo.